The alarm pierced through the quiet night at Dover Air Force Base at exactly 2:37 a.m., jolting Captain Sarah Mitchell from her deep sleep in the crew quarters. She sat up instantly, her heart already racing as the emergency klaxon echoed through the hallways, a sound that every pilot dreaded but trained for relentlessly. Within seconds, her phone lit up with a message she had been half expecting for weeks. Immediate deployment. Medical evacuation. Middle East. Crew report to aircraft in 15 minutes. Sarah swung her legs out of bed and grabbed her flight suit, her hands moving with practiced efficiency even as her mind raced through 1,000 calculations. This was not a drill, and somewhere thousands of miles away, American service members needed her and her crew to do the impossible. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. By 2:45 a.m., the entire crew had assembled at the massive C-17 Globemaster III that sat on the tarmac like a sleeping giant waiting to be awakened. Captain Mitchell was joined by her co-pilot, First Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez, a sharp young officer who had flown through some of the worst weather conditions imaginable without flinching. Their loadmaster was Technical Sergeant James Chen, a veteran with 12 years of experience who could secure cargo in his sleep, and their flight engineer was Staff Sergeant Rebecca Torres, whose knowledge of the C-17 systems was legendary throughout the squadron. "What's the situation, Captain?" Maria asked as they performed their pre-flight walk-around, their flashlights cutting through the darkness to inspect every critical component of the enormous aircraft. Sarah pulled out her mission briefing tablet and read the details that made her stomach tighten with concern. "There's been an accident at a forward operating base near the Iraqi border," Sarah explained, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Multiple casualties, some critical. The local medical facilities are overwhelmed, and we need to evacuate 23 wounded personnel to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. But here's the problem. There's a massive sandstorm moving through the region, and our window to land is maybe 45 minutes before visibility drops to zero." Maria let out a low whistle, understanding immediately what that meant. They would have to fly nearly 7,000 miles, refuel in Madeira at least twice, and land in one of the most challenging environments imaginable, all while racing against a natural disaster and carrying wounded soldiers whose lives depended on speed and precision. Rebecca looked up from her inspection of the landing gear and said what everyone was thinking. "No pressure, right?" The pre-flight checks took exactly 8 minutes, with each crew member working in perfect synchronization, despite the early hour and the weight of their mission. Sarah climbed into the left seat of the cockpit, the familiar smell of avionics and jet fuel filling her nostrils as she began powering up the systems. The instrument panels came alive with hundreds of lights and displays, each one telling her something vital about the health of their aircraft. Maria slid into the right seat and immediately began coordinating with air traffic control, while Rebecca monitored the engine start sequence, and James prepared the cargo bay for the medical equipment and personnel they would need. "Dover Tower. This is Reach 721 requesting immediate clearance for emergency departure," Maria transmitted, her voice calm and professional. The response came back instantly. "Reach 721. You are clear for immediate departure, runway 20 left. Godspeed." The 4 massive Pratt & Whitney engines roared to life one by one, each producing over 40,000 pounds of thrust that made the entire aircraft vibrate with barely contained power. Sarah released the brakes at exactly 3:08 a.m., and the C-17 began rolling down the runway, gathering speed until a moment when physics and engineering combined to lift nearly 300,000 pounds of metal, fuel, and determination into the dark Virginia sky. The gear came up with a solid thunk, and they banked eastward toward the Atlantic Ocean, beginning a journey that would test every skill they possessed. Time to destination is 9 hours and 42 minutes at current speed, Rebecca announced from her station behind the pilots. But if that sandstorm moves faster than predicted, we might not have that long. 3 hours into the flight, as they crossed over the Atlantic at 35,000 feet, Sarah noticed the first sign of trouble. A yellow caution light appeared on her display, indicating a hydraulic pressure fluctuation in the number 3 system. It was not critical yet, but it was something that needed monitoring. "Rebecca, I'm seeing some anomalies in hydraulic system 3. Can you pull up the diagnostics?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice level to avoid alarming the crew unnecessarily. Rebecca's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up detailed system information that revealed a slow but steady pressure drop. It's within acceptable parameters for now, Captain, but if it continues to degrade, we might lose some redundancy in our flight controls, Rebecca reported, her brow furrowed with concern. Sarah made a decision quickly. They would continue the mission, but prepare contingency plans for a hydraulic failure. As they approached their first aerial refueling point over the Mediterranean Sea at 6:15 a.m., the situation became more complex. The KC-135 tanker that was supposed to meet them had been delayed by 15 minutes due to air traffic congestion over southern Europe. Reach 721, this is Copper 37. We're running behind schedule. Can you hold at current position? The tanker pilot's voice crackled over the radio. Sarah did the mental math instantly. Every minute they waited was a minute closer to that sandstorm, making their landing impossible. Copper 37, negative on a hold. We have wounded personnel waiting, and a weather window that's closing fast. What's your best speed to intercept? Sarah responded, her tone firm but respectful. There was a pause. Then the tanker pilot came back. Roger that. Reach. We're pushing it to max speed. Give us 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes felt like an eternity as Sarah watched the fuel gauges slowly decline while they circled over the sparkling blue Mediterranean. Maria kept running calculations on their fuel consumption, determining the absolute minimum they needed to complete the mission. James had moved to the cockpit and stood between the pilot seats, his eyes also fixed on the gauges. We're cutting it really close, Captain, he said quietly. If we don't get fuel in the next 12 minutes, we'll have to divert to Sigonella and scrub the mission. Sarah felt the weight of command pressing down on her shoulders, knowing that 23 wounded soldiers were counting on them, but also knowing that she could not risk her crew or aircraft beyond reasonable limits. Then, like an answer to a prayer, Maria called out, "Visual contact. Tanker at 2 o'clock, 5 miles. The aerial refueling took 18 minutes of flying in tight formation behind the tanker, while a boom operator carefully guided the refueling probe into the C-17's receptacle. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls as she maintained perfect position despite some moderate turbulence, her years of training making the complex maneuver look almost effortless. When the final gallons of jet fuel flowed into their tanks and the boom disconnected with a metallic clunk, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. Copper 37, Reach 721 is complete on the refuel. Thanks for the hustle. Those troops on the ground owe you one, Sarah transmitted. Just bring them home safe. Reach, that's all the thanks we need, came the reply, and the tanker peeled away into the morning sky. As they crossed into a rocky airspace at 8:43 a.m., the landscape below transformed into an endless expanse of tan and brown desert. The air traffic controller at the forward operating base came on the radio with an update that made Sarah's blood run cold. Reach 721. Be advised a sandstorm has accelerated. Current visibility at the landing zone is 3 miles and deteriorating rapidly. Winds gusting to 45 knots. We estimate you have maybe 20 minutes before conditions become unflyable. Sarah exchanged glances with Maria, and both pilots knew they had no margin for error now. Rebecca called up the approach charts on her display and began reviewing the emergency landing procedures while James moved back to the cargo bay to prepare for the fastest loading operation of his career. At 8:57 a.m., they began their descent through increasingly hazy air as the leading edge of the sandstorm began to envelope the region. The visibility dropped from 3 miles to 2 miles, then to 1 mile as they continued lower. Sarah switched on the landing lights, which created strange halos in the dust-filled air. Landing gear down, Maria called out, and they felt a familiar rumble as the wheels extended and locked into position. At 500 feet above the ground, they finally saw the runway through brown haze, a strip of concrete that looked impossibly short and narrow from their perspective. Sarah's hands moved with precision on the controls, adjusting for the strong crosswinds that buffeted the massive aircraft. 100 feet, 50 feet, 30 feet. Maria called out the altitudes as the ground rushed up to meet them. The main wheels touched down with a firm chirp of rubber on concrete at exactly 9:04 a.m., and Sarah immediately deployed the thrust reversers while applying the brakes. The C-17 decelerated rapidly, and she guided it off the runway onto the taxiway where a convoy of ambulances and medical vehicles were already waiting. Before the engines had even fully spooled down, James had the cargo ramp lowering, and a team of medics rushed aboard with stretchers carrying wounded soldiers. Sarah watched from the cockpit as her crew sprang into action, helping secure the patients and medical equipment with incredible speed and efficiency. The wind was howling now, and visibility had dropped to less than a quarter mile as the sandstorm fully enveloped the base. They had made it with perhaps 5 minutes to spare. "Captain, we got all 23 personnel aboard and secured. Medical team is requesting immediate departure." James reported over the intercom, slightly out of breath from a frantic loading operation. Sarah was already bringing the engines back up to power, knowing that every second on the ground was a second they might get trapped by the worsening weather. "Tower, Reach 721 is ready for immediate departure with medical evacuation," Sarah transmitted. The response was urgent. "Reach 721, you are clear for immediate takeoff any runway. Visibility now 18 mile and dropping. You are probably the last aircraft getting out of here today." Sarah felt her pulse quicken but kept her voice steady as she responded, "Roger, rolling now." The takeoff through the sandstorm was one of the most challenging moments of Sarah's career, flying entirely on instruments as the world outside the cockpit disappeared into a brown void. But the C-17 climbed steadily, and at 3,000 feet, they burst through the top of the storm into clear blue sky. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she heard Maria let out a breath she had been holding. Behind them, in the cargo bay, doctors and nurses were already working on the wounded, performing emergency procedures at 35,000 feet that would keep their patients stable for the long flight to Germany. Rebecca gave Sarah a thumbs up from her station. The hydraulic issue had stabilized, and all systems were running normally now. "Well done, everyone," Sarah said over the intercom. "Now, let's get these heroes home." 9 hours later, as they touched down at Landstuhl just after sunset, Sarah watched through the cockpit windows as ambulances raced out to meet them. Every single one of the 23 wounded soldiers had survived the flight, and as Sarah climbed down from the cockpit, a young Army medic who had been caring for the patients during the flight approached her with tears in his eyes. "Ma'am, you and your crew saved lives today. 5 of these soldiers wouldn't have made it another 2 hours without proper medical facilities. You gave them a fighting chance." Sarah felt the exhaustion of the 18-hour mission wash over her, but also a profound sense of purpose. This was why she wore the uniform, why she had spent years training for moments exactly like this. As her crew gathered near the aircraft, tired but proud, she realized that they had proven something important. That courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The mission was complete, and 23 families would get to see their loved ones again.